Welcome back. Now that we have a good understanding of what a business model is, and we've talked about how to market a startup, we also need to understand how to fund a startup. Many times when people are launching a new business, they don't have the money they need themselves to actually launch the company. So we will talk about how you can launch a company by yourself with limited funding, using a method called bootstrapping. But we're also going to talk about 9 other methods as well that companies can use and individuals can use to fund a startup. So first of all, bootstrapping, which I alluded to a few minutes ago, is when people are actually utilizing their own funds. And then you can use friends and family money. You can use banks and credit unions, community development funds. There's what's called crowdfunding, which we'll talk about what that is in a moment. Online lending of money, where people can obviously go online and get money from different institutions that want to lend to founders. There's angel investors. So if we think of Shark Tank, for example, they're an example of angel investors. There's grants that can be provided. So not only are grants provided to students, for example, for college, but grants are also available to startup companies to drive innovation, for example. There's pitch competitions that are available at colleges and some high schools and just in the general world. And then there's strategic partnerships, which are funding that can be generated from companies that are interested in the future of that particular startup and how it might have a positive impact on their business. So let's talk about bootstrapping, and I'm going to provide you some examples as we kind of move along here as well. So bootstrapping is a method of self-funding a startup. The founder or founders are using their own money. So the concept behind bootstrapping is when you're pulling yourself up by the bootstraps means that you're actually doing it yourself. So here's an example. Kara is developing a kombucha company. Kara only needs enough money to purchase a basic website, ingredients, bottles, and transportation expenses to take to her taste testers to get feedback. She estimates her start costs are going to be about $1,000, and she has enough money in her bank account. She's been working at a retail store, and so she saved that money up herself. So in this case, Kara doesn't need to take the time to build a pitch deck and go through all of the other exercises in doing a formal, what's called a capital raise. She can actually fund it herself. So the advantage of doing this is she can start really quickly. There is a disadvantage. Sometimes when you're raising startup money and you go to angel investors, for example, they could actually add some insights. Maybe they have some experience in that particular field. But the advantage is that you can launch really, really quickly. Friends and family. As the name implies, when startup founders don't have enough money to bootstrap their startup, sometimes they'll go and they'll ask friends and family, and this is called a friends and family round, and sometimes jokingly it's called friends, fools, and family, because as we know, many times startups don't work out in the long run. And so one of the things I always caution people in doing is actually raising money from friends and family. You need to be very upfront and acknowledge to them that there's a good chance that they could lose this money. I personally don't like to raise money from friends and family because I never want to have that difficult conversation over the Thanksgiving table, for example, if I lost all of the money and the company didn't work out. But it's a personal decision, and raising money through friends and family can be another very quick way to generate funds for your startup. And you don't have to, again, go through all the formal steps of doing an online campaign or doing an angel investor pitch, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So here's an example. So Jake is a video game developer, and he's building a service that connects elite esports gamers. So think of competitive video gaming. Jake can do most of the software development himself, but he's going to need some graphic designers to actually help design what's called the UI, the user interface. And he's going to need about $20,000. Jake has an aunt and an uncle that are entrepreneurs, and they really want him to be an entrepreneur. And so they want to encourage these dreams that he has. The aunt and the uncle don't have expertise in this area, but they are going to provide him this funding, which will allow him to quickly actually launch the startup. So banks and credit unions. Banks and credit unions can also be a good source of raising money for businesses. Many small, medium, and large businesses indeed use them. And they are used by some startups, but they do tend to be quite risk averse, especially post 2008 after the stock market crash. So you do get some very innovative banks that are willing to take a risk and work with startups, but many times they want loans that can be collateralized with things like large amounts of savings accounts. It could be office equipment. It could be homes, things like that, in case someone defaults on the loan. So here's an example of a banks and a credit union. One. So Raj is creating a new clothing line for young professionals who work remotely but still need to look good. So if we think what we call above the keyboard attire these days in the remote world that we live in. Raj's family already has a building that he can use to design the clothes, but he needs $20,000 for sewing machines, tables, a website, and he's going to be hiring a local person with expertise. A bank or a credit union could be a good option because banks and small banks, especially and local credit unions, again, want to help the local community. So in this case, they know the money is going to be spent locally and then they're going to be help providing new jobs. So this would be an example where a bank and a credit union might make sense. Community development funds are loans that are provided to help local businesses with the intention of creating local jobs. And as you can imagine, many times these community development funds, a lot of times they'll actually work with local banks as well. They'll collaborate. So here's an example of using community development funds. Asuka is launching a new company that will build tiny homes. If you're familiar with tiny homes, Elon Musk has kind of made these famous now. And so the idea is people want to minimize their expenses, and so they're a rather large box that is constructed in a factory, and they will drop it on the piece of land that you want, and you can live very economically. So $50,000, I believe. So Asuka is actually making a company that's actually going to build tiny homes. He needs $500,000 or $500,000 for a manufacturing facility. He's going to have local architects, engineers, production workers, and there's community development funds in this particular town that are trying to reduce unemployment. So in this particular case, community development funds would be a perfect example. And usually these function in the form of a grant. So the money is actually provided to the business. It does not need to be paid back. It's not like a loan that you would get from a bank or a credit union, for example. Crowdfunding. We actually have a whole second video that I'm going to be sharing with you about crowdfunding. But crowdfunding is a method of raising money through the internet to help a business, a project, or a special cause. For the sake of this video, we're actually just going to be talking about crowdfunding as it relates to helping fund a startup. So, Amy has created a smartphone case, in this case, no pun intended, that can be charged with solar power. Amy needs $250,000 or $250,000 to develop a prototype. She's got to get a patent, and she wants to make a run of a first 1,000 cases. So usually, if you're making a brand new product and you want to test it out with people and you're going to have a beta, you're going to actually have to pay a manufacturing company to make some. And they're usually not just going to they'll make a mold, and give you an example of one or two, but you might have to commit to doing a first run. So in this case, she needs to do a first run of 1,000 cases, and this $250,000 is going to cover that. And she wants to also market the product at the same time. And so using a platform such as Kickstarter, again, which we'll get into in a future video, is a great way to raise funds. Online lending. So online lending is a method of receiving loans through non-traditional lenders, not a bank or a credit union. So an online loan does not require typically collateral, like putting up a home, for example. In our online lending example, Graham buys and sells rare athletic shoes, and he already has an established business, but now what he wants to do is expand and get more expensive and even more rare shoes. And so, because he's got a track record of success in generating revenue, he might go to a service such as Cabbage, for example, and they actually might provide him a loan. Angel investors, or angels, we're all familiar with, especially they've been popularized by the show Shark Tank. If you haven't watched it, you must watch Shark Tank just to get an experience. And you can kind of understand some of the various nuances of angel investing. So angel investors are basically, it could be an individual or individuals or even groups of investors that actually pool their money together to fund startups in exchange for equity. So here's an example. So Devante has developed a mobile app that sends emergency alerts to emergency services when someone's having a seizure or a heart attack, for example, an elderly person. And so he's developed the software, but he needs money for marketing and he wants investors with experience in medical technology. Unlike the other methods that we've talked about so far, none of these people had to have an expert in order to be successful, or they didn't feel that they needed to. But Devante has identified, look, this is a niche, this is a really specific product where we're going to need some expertise. There could be a lot of competition. And so in this case, raising money, let's say he needs $1 million, for example, which wouldn't be unheard of. Angel investing and getting angel investors that have specific, for example, health tech experience could make sense. Grants. Grants are monies that can be provided to startups without giving up any equity. So with angel investing, what's happening is we are receiving money, but in return, obviously, we're giving up a portion of our company. With the grants and these loans that we've been discussing, you are not giving up any equity. And grants are typically provided by institutions that are seeking to accomplish a mission. And the grant could come from the federal government, could come from state government, local government, etc. So an example is Ayana, let's say, is developing a mental health service for Native Americans that is delivered through a mobile app. She's already developed the app, but she might need funding to pay therapists, for example, that are going to be providing counseling through the app itself. So she might be able to reach out to an organization, for example, specifically that wants to help Native Americans, like the Native American Business Development Institute. Pitch competitions. Pitch competitions, like their name implies, are events where entrepreneurs will compete for prizes. The prizes are typically money for funding of startups, or sometimes they're even services like hosting services, etc. So I've been involved in probably hundreds of competitions at this point, whether it's helping manage them or preparing students for competitions. But if you are currently a student and there's an opportunity to participate in a pitch competition, it's a great way to get some experience, sharing your business model and getting feedback from judges, and indeed a relatively simple way to get exposed to pitching investors or angel investors would be like. So here's an example of a pitch competition. So Sophia has developed a social startup that takes unused food from university dining halls and provides them to food pantries. And she wants to run a pilot on college campuses, on 3 college campuses, and hire college students. And so a pitch competition in this case could be a great way for her to raise startup capital. And lastly, we've got strategic partnerships. Strategic partnerships are investments that are made by organizations, typically companies, in exchange for equity in a startup that adds strategic value. So we've got a large company that is seeking to grow and become more innovative, for example, and there's a startup that could eventually add value to the company. Maybe they'll actually acquire the company long term. But the startup is really quick and nimble, and they need a small amount of money to get rolling or to accelerate their growth. And so strategic partnerships are getting very, very popular these days. So here's our strategic partnership example. So Daniel is a civil engineer, and he's developed a new chemical that helps highways withstand severe heat. So if you're in a part of the world when you're watching watching this video and you see that the highways will buckle. Sometimes it's from getting cold and then getting really hot again. And so he's developed a chemical that can help withstand that. And so Daniel needs money for additional research and development. And Daniels actually approached a chemical company that said they would provide funding, obviously in return for equity in his company. So it could be a whole different product line for this company, that an area of business that they never thought about getting into before. So there you have all of the major ways of raising startup capital, everything from bootstrapping all the way to strategic partnerships.